In the place where you feel the safest, something is watching you in plain sight. Faces appear in places where nothing should fit. Heads drop down to stare at you from the ceiling, and figures are squeezed into spaces that no one should ever occupy. This episode will take you through 3 cases that will leave you double-checking every nook and cranny around you in your home. I'm Josh Nokia. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. In February of 2022, Beth was walking out her bathroom in her house when something caught her eye. Just to the side of the bathroom door, there was a lamp. And while it was tall, it wasn't a very large lamp. It was actually quite narrow. But as she glanced at it on this day, she noticed that there was something different. It almost looked like there was something behind it. Now, to Beth, it looked like there was a figure standing behind the lamp, looking at her between it and the wall. But what was really strange about it was that she couldn't see all of it, and that was impossible. It didn't make sense. The lamp was so narrow that Beth should have been able to see much more of whatever this was, but no matter how hard she stared, she could only see about half of it, and that half included a face. Now, from what Beth could tell, it seemed to be a woman's face, and when she tried to describe it later, Beth said that the face seemed to have an intense or angry look, and it also had no eyebrows and long, stringy black hair. Right away, she jumped and she was frozen and never took her eyes off the face and its strange angle. Her mind was just racing to figure out what this could be, and the other half of this face was invisible. Like it just wasn't there, or it was simply cut off. As for the rest of the body, she couldn't see that either. Was it simply a trick of the light? Even though she had cats, she was the only one in this house. Instinctively, Beth took a step back, and when she did, she momentarily looked away from this thing behind the lamp. It wasn't long, but it was long enough, because when she looked back, it was now gone. And she stood there for a moment and she began to tell herself that, she's tired, she's saying things, that it had to have been a trick of the light or something. But she realized that she was in a brightly lit room. So something had to have been back there, but there was simply no way that something could have possibly hidden behind that lamp. But all she could do was shrug and accept that whatever it was now gone. Now, for the next couple months, she pushed this strange event out of her mind. She tried to just rationalize it as nothing more than an illusion. But in May of that year, Beth was sitting in her living room with her partner, and they were watching a movie. All of a sudden, they hear this loud banging sound coming from somewhere in the home. It actually sounded like somebody was pounding on one of the interior doors. Beth has noticed that over the years. She's heard a lot of strange noises coming from this home, but she's always been able to write them off as just the house settling. But this time, the sound was just too loud to ignore. Initially, she thought it could have been the cats, but the noise was just way too loud for it to have come from them. And just in case she thought she was imagining things, her partner heard it too. So they paused the movie and they both sat there waiting to see if the banging would come back. But after a moment, there was no noise. And they kind of looked at each other and just shrugged, not really sure what it was. And Beth suggested, well, maybe something fell. That had to be it, right? They both got up and they started going from room to room, just trying to figure out the source of the sound, but of course, they turned up empty. Everything was in its place. Even the cats were sleeping. Simply put, there was no explanation. But later on that evening, though, Beth's mind just kind of kept wandering back to that event that happened back in February, where she saw the face, and she couldn't help but think that it, or her, or whatever it was, had something to do with it. Now, even though it seemed ridiculous, the human mind does try to find patterns and connections, even when they don't exist. In fact, a couple more months would pass with no strange occurrences in the home, but then, one evening, something really odd happened. Something that took Beth back to the first day outside the bathroom. It was night, and Beth was in bed, and the room was mostly dark, and her partner was fast asleep right next to her. But Beth was wide awake, just staring at the ceiling, thinking about work-related things that were stressing her out. At some point, she kind of just turned her head to look at the side of the room, and she saw it again. It was in the exact same spot where she had seen it back in February, behind that same lamp next to the bathroom door, and in fact, it appeared the same way. It just the top part of what appeared to be a face hovering between the lamp and the wall. Now, granted, this time the room was darker, but there was no mistaking it. She knew that this was the same thing that she had seen before, and her body immediately tensed up. She could sense that something was really wrong. Wanting confirmation that she wasn't crazy, she wanted really badly to wake up her boyfriend sleeping next to her, but she wasn't sure if she should reach over and shake him or not, thinking that the figure would simply disappear as soon as she looked away. And what would he do if he did see it? I mean, she had no idea what this was, and she didn't know if it was dangerous. In what felt like this act of courage that took every ounce of her strength, she reached over, turned on the lamp on her bedside table, and as soon as the light filled the room, her boyfriend kind of groaned and rolled over, but he stayed asleep. And of course, when she looked back at the lamp next to the door, it was gone. Getting up to investigate, Beth got out of bed, turned on all the lights, checked the entire house. She looked behind furniture, under the beds, and closets, and couldn't find anything. Probably the most disturbing thing about all this is that she had seen the figure in the exact same location. How was it connected, though, to the sounds like the banging? She wasn't sure, but she went to spend the rest of the night in the living room with all the lights on, and she wasn't going to sleep at all. She was just going to wait for the sun to come up. Unfortunately, she never did find out what it was or what it wanted. What Beth saw peeking out at her is anyone's guess. It could have been anything, but whatever it was, its ability to defy the laws of physics and appear in the tiniest of spaces suggests that our reality is not its home, that it comes from somewhere else. But the thing that peeked out at Beth sounds a lot like the Sakima Onna, or the Gap Woman. The Gap Woman is a type of supernatural entity from Japanese folklore. Some say she is just an urban legend. Others claim that she is one of the several yokai beings from Japanese mythology. But whoever or whatever she is, the Gap Woman is said to haunt the narrow spaces within our very homes, be it the sliver between a dresser and the wall, beneath the bed, or even the smallest cracks in the floorboards, or, like in Beth's story, between a lamp and the wall. In the grand scheme of things, stories about this being are relatively new, although not as new as you might think. While lots of people know about her through the internet, the Gap Woman's origins trace back far earlier, having first appeared in a collection of Edo period legends compiled by Negishi Yasumori around the beginning of the 1800s. Negishi was a samurai who held a pretty high-up admin job during the last years of this time, and in his free time, over the course of decades, he gathered all sorts of stories and folktales from people he met. He actually ended up putting them together in a 10-volume collection called Mimi Bukuro, with 100 stories in each, and one of them contains the first appearance of the Gap Woman, and it went like this. A young man who owned a tea shop had just moved into a new place, and not long after, he noticed something strange with a sliding door on the second floor. It would only open halfway, and when a servant tried to fix it, the door jammed. But weirdly, when the shopkeeper gave it a try, it slid open just fine. Well, the next day it was stuck again, and one of the servants tried to force it open, and out of nowhere, a woman suddenly appeared from the narrow space where the door slides into the wall. She grabbed at the servant, who freaked out and slammed the door shut, and just like that, the Gap Woman was gone. Even that early story shows how the Gap Woman likes to target people. Once she fixates on someone, her constant staring can lead to feelings of isolation or madness. The unluckiest victims disappear. It is said that anyone making eye contact with her gets taken into her realm. To prevent being kidnapped, those targeted often cover every empty space in their home in this obsessive, futile quest to escape her gaze. Supposedly, there's even a male variation, Tsukima Otoko, the Gap Man, who similarly likes to trap people through crevices of their homes. In fact, a more recent story shows how the Gap Woman appears nowadays in Japan. A few years ago, a 25-year-old man named Haruki moved into a small house in the historic city of Kyoto, Japan. Haruki had just landed a new job at a tech company, and this house, which was surprisingly affordable given its location, was perfect for this new chapter in his life. The house was fairly old, but it had recently been renovated, and it had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a pretty modest living area. And nothing about it seemed unusual or strange. For the first few weeks, he was pretty happy there. He would go to work during the day, come home in the evening, watch some TV, and then simply go to bed. It was a simple, comfortable routine. But, about a month goes by and he began to notice some strange things. Like when he was home alone, he would hear what sounded like movement in other parts. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it was like soft shuffling sounds or like someone gently dragging their feet on the floor. Of course, he dismissed it initially because maybe it was somebody moving around in an adjacent unit. But over time, these sounds continued and, in fact, they became more frequent. And he started to feel like he wasn't exactly alone. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, he distinctly heard what sounded like breathing coming from somewhere in his bedroom, but he couldn't discern where. But the sound was so close that it made him really begin to panic. And he immediately turned on all the lights and he searched the house and he checked under the bed and inside the closet, behind their furniture. You guys know the gist. Anywhere someone could possibly be hiding. But guess what? He found nothing. Surprise. He went to bed with no problems, but it was the first thought that entered his mind when he woke up. The next day at work, he couldn't even concentrate, and it was then that he devised his plan. When he got home from work that evening, instead of his usual routine, he decided to conduct another thorough search. He looked in every nook and cranny, every corner, every potential hiding spot. Either he's going crazy and he's paranoid, or there's something in his home. He even checked spaces that were clearly too small for a person to fit into. And again, there was nothing. Despite winding up empty-handed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was in his house with him. And over the next several days, he began to seal up what he perceived as potential hiding spots, even ones that were way too small to hide anyone. He used packing tape to cover the gap underneath his sofa, and, he taped over the space behind the fridge, and even the small openings around the AC until he had sealed it shut. It was clear that he was becoming increasingly paranoid. Well, 2 weeks later, after the sounds first started, he just stopped going to work. In fact, he called in sick for a few days and then he just stopped calling altogether. He was too afraid to leave his house because he was convinced that whatever was hiding there would reveal itself if he wasn't there to monitor it. Guys, is it just me or does this sound like some sort of modern psychological thriller? Well, instead, he stayed home, barely sleeping, constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. Now, Haruki even stopped going outside entirely. He had food delivered, left at his door, which, he would quickly grab before locking himself back inside. His windows remained shut and covered with blinds or curtains at all times, and gosh, he just began losing it. After he had been absent from work for over a week with no communication, his colleagues started to worry. They tried calling him multiple times, but, he never answered. So a few of them decided that they should perform a wellness check. Well, they arrived and they were immediately concerned. The outside looked neglected. There were several days worth of newspaper piled up at the door and the plants on a small porch were wilting. When they knocked, nobody answered. They knocked again and called out his name, but there was nothing. They were probably convinced that he had died in there. One of the men, named Takashi, was closest to Haruki. He actually tried the door handle, and of course, he was surprised to find it unlocked. Concerned for the safety of their friend, the group of these men entered the house cautiously, and what they saw scared them. The house was in complete disarray. It stank. There were empty food containers scattered everywhere, and I'm surprised there wasn't roaches. None of the trash had been taken out. The strangest part of all this was the tape. There was tape everywhere. They're covering gaps in the walls and sealing cabinet doors shut, and it was stretched across the spaces underneath the furniture. It was clear that Haruki was losing his mind by trying to cover every seal possible in the home. Takashi called out to him, telling him that his coworkers had come to check on him. They listened, but there was no response. So the group decided to move deeper into the home, and they carefully checked each room as they went, hoping he was in there, but he wasn't. So when they at last reached the bedroom, they found him. He was lying on the floor in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, and he looked terrible. His hair was a mess. He had clearly lost weight from not really eating, and his eyes just had dark circles under them because he hadn't slept well in days. All four of these men were convinced he was really sick or dying. But Haruki was just completely terrified, and he looked at his coworkers and that he was gravely concerned for their safety and explained to them that now that they're here, she's not going to let them leave. Of course, they had no idea what he was talking about. Who wouldn't let them leave? The house was empty. But in his crazed stupor, he slowly raised his hand and pointed to a corner of the room, completely trembling. And he explained to them that she was there, between the dresser and the wall. She was there, that she had always been there. When the four men had looked, on the other side of the room was a small dresser pressed against the wall. And between the dresser and the wall was a slight gap, a very narrow space. No more than 2 inches at most. But none of the four men saw anything, and they're like, dude, he's losing it. Haruki just went on to explain in these broken, paranoid sentences everything that he had gone through. The sounds, the paranoia, just him trapping himself in his own home. The guy was clearly having a mental breakdown. But Takashi and his colleagues were very worried for him, so they're like, you know what, let's go check out the dresser. He's very concerned about this. And, they wanted to reassure him because they were worried about his well-being. So the four men approached the gap between the dresser and the wall. And interestingly, as they got closer, they both felt this chill go down all their bodies. It was really strange. And, they stopped and looked at each other like, okay, this is strange, but all right. And they leaned in to look into the gap. There shouldn't be anything back there, but what they saw made them both jump back because somehow squeezed impossibly into this 2-inch space was a girl, or at least part of her. They could see her face pressed against the wall, her long black hair cascading down the narrow space, and she was wearing what looked like a red dress, though it was hard to make out in the darkness. Her eyes were wide open and she was staring at them, and in complete fear and panic, Takashi and the other 3 men just stumbled backwards, and they're in shock, they're cursing, they're shouting. And as that was happening, this pair of slender, pale hands, a woman's hands, reached out into the room, reaching for these men. And in complete panic, all 4 men screamed and they ran out of the room. All of them, of course, just stumbling over each other, trying to get out as fast as they could. They got to the front door, they flung it open, they all ran outside. They got to their car, which was parked on the street because they had carpooled. They jump inside, they close the door, and they realize something. They do a body count. Oh no. They had left Haruki behind. Several of the men suggested that we got to go back and save their coworker. But the others claimed that that was a bad idea. And as you might imagine, it didn't take much convincing to just let the police handle it. Well, Haruki's coworkers drove away, swearing that they would call the cops as soon as they were far enough away, but we all know that by the time they reached a place where they felt safe, they couldn't do it. They just couldn't make the call. They were worried that making that call would somehow invite whatever that being was, that yokai, into their own lives. And their indecision led to some serious consequences, because no one ever saw Haruki again. In fact, law enforcement did eventually conduct a search of the house after Haruki was eventually reported missing by his employer, but they found no trace of him. The house was empty. There was no sign of a struggle or anything out of the ordinary, apart from the use of tape on all the openings. And in the weeks after, the 4 colleagues who had seen the girl in the gap began to experience those same strange events in their home. The story goes that one by one, they too all disappeared. Now, by the time anyone realized there was some sort of connection between these disappearances and Haruki's, it was simply too late. And probably the most frightening part of all this, where did these 5 men get taken to? That remains a mystery. Of course, no one knows whether or not Haruki's run-in with the Gap Woman actually happened, or if it's just, urban legend, but we do know that more reliable sources have surfaced over the years from people who describe a very similar phenomenon. Luckily, most people who encounter this stuff nowadays don't suffer the same fate, but that doesn't mean that their experiences still don't leave them absolutely terrified. In April of 2018, a woman named Clara and her fiancé Sam were moving into their new apartment in Kentucky. It was a beautiful historic building. It had been built all the way back in 1898, and they were just so excited about this place because it had beautiful high ceilings, hardwood floors, gorgeous bay windows. The building itself had a very interesting history. It was originally constructed to house offices, but in the 70s, it was converted into apartments. And so the couple loved the idea of living in a space with so much history. But what they didn't realize is that sometimes when you move into a place like that, the history doesn't want to stay in the past. The couple had been living in the apartment for about 2 weeks when they began noticing strange things. They would both suddenly wake up at exactly 2 in the morning, and they just kind of, wrote it off as a coincidence. That there's, maybe something about the home, maybe one of them was having a dream or, restlessness, but either way, they couldn't figure it out. And one night, Sam woke up at 2 in the morning, as had become their routine, but this time it was different because as he was laying there in bed, he looked over toward their bedroom doorway and he saw something that really bothered him. What he saw was a hand, just a hand gripping the door frame as if somebody was standing in the hallway, peeking into the room. And this hand was so pale that it almost seemed to glow in the darkness. Immediately panicked, he sat up in bed and called out, asking who was there. This, of course, woke Clara up, but by the time she was alert, the hand had vanished. Sam explained to her what he had seen and they immediately got up to check the apartment. They went room by room, turning on all the lights, checking closets, looking under furniture, but, there was nothing there. The front door was still locked with the deadbolt secured and all the windows were closed. Folks, there was simply no way anyone could have gotten in. They eventually just convinced themselves that it must have been some kind of half dream, maybe some sort of hallucination, which is something that can happen when you're between being awake and being asleep. But either way, neither of them really believed that explanation. And so a few nights later, it was Clara's turn to see something. And once again, it happened at exactly 2 in the morning. Clara got up to get a glass of water, and once that was done, she headed back to the bedroom. Once she started to get to the hallway, she saw a figure of a woman in the doorway up ahead. Now the woman was just standing there completely still, peeking into the room, staring at Sam as he slept. Of course, Clara wanted to scream, but before she could even process what she was seeing, the woman was gone. So she ran back into the bedroom and woke up Sam. And they again searched the entire apartment and they found nothing. The front door was still locked, all the windows were still closed, and there was still no explanation for what Clara had seen. Now, this went on for months, and strange things continued happening. One morning, she was making breakfast when a glass suddenly fell from the counter and shattered. There was no one near it, it just fell. Weeks after that, the exact same thing happened with another glass. Clara felt confident that she could rule out the possibility of a draft or, something like that. Another night, Sam was making dinner and he went to grab a knife from the cutlery tray, but the knife he wanted wasn't there. He knew that they had just washed it, so he asked his girlfriend if they had moved it. She hadn't, and they looked around the kitchen, but it was no use. Just when they were about to give up, they found the knife on the other side of the kitchen, placed neatly on the counter, which is weird. Neither of them had put it there, but fast forward to December, one evening, Claire was in the living room and Sam was in the bedroom. They both heard this loud crash from the kitchen, so they ran to see what was happening and got there at the same time, and together discovered that the dish rack had somehow fallen from the sink. 3 bowls and a pair of plates that had been drying in it now lay shattered on the floor, as if they had been picked up and tossed down. It seemed possible that the rack might have slipped, but given everything else that had happened in their apartment over the last few months, they seriously doubted that. Both were very creeped out by all this stuff happening, and they were seriously considering moving, but, they had signed a year-long lease with some pretty substantial penalties for breaking it early. And they couldn't afford to lose that money. So they're like, you know what, let's just stick it out. We can do this. We only have another, 4 or 5 months left anyway. Let's just, we'll be fine. Unfortunately, the situation, though, continued getting worse. Sam would go on to have horrific nightmares. He'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, but he could never exactly remember what the dreams were about. But it got so bad to the point to where he was afraid to even sleep, and, he would purposefully keep himself awake, and he became very sleep deprived. Clara began catching glimpses of shadows moving in and out of the hallway, and, she had to try to convince herself it was her imagination, but she noticed that even their cats were acting strange. And twice in 3 days, she saw both of them tearing out of the hallway at full speed like they were running from something. She didn't see what, but she could only guess. One night when Clara was doing the dishes, she heard the sound behind her, and as she turned around, she actually saw this glass lift itself from the sink and just drop onto the floor, shattering into pieces. However, just a few days later, this would be the worst. Clara was sitting all alone on the couch, reading, just trying to keep her mind off things, and she's really engrossed in the book she's reading, and suddenly, she gets this intense feeling that someone's looking at her. She keeps her eyes locked on the page because she doesn't want to acknowledge it, she doesn't want to look up. Without moving her head too much, she allows her eyes to kind of drift up in the direction of the hallway. There, in the doorframe, is a woman's head. What Clara sees is just a head, no body, dark hair, and pale skin, and it is tilted sideways, like peeking over the edge of the doorframe. But the most disturbing thing is that it isn't looking into the room at head height. This face is looking at Clara from the very top of the doorway, higher up than any head should ever be. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the woman's eyes and Clara's eyes meet, and the face seems to look just as surprised as she is, like it didn't expect to be seen. Completely overcome with fear, the head lifts up and to the right, like a very tall person is standing up straight, and then it's just gone. No sign that it has ever been there. And as you know, she is just beyond scared. She's so scared she couldn't even scream. All she could do is just stare, and she begins to just disassociate. So when she finally comes out of this fear-driven paralysis, she grabs her phone, grabs her keys, and she just ran straight out of the apartment. She drove to her mom's house, and she's like, you know what? She explained to her mom what had happened. She's like, I need to stay here for several days. I'm just too scared to come home. Sam, of course, didn't want to be there alone either, and he went to go stay with a friend. And unfortunately, they both knew they couldn't go back there, and, they would just have to just leave it be for a while. They didn't know who or what was there, but it wasn't something they wanted to live with. Eventually, they did go back, but only during the daytime, and they never spent the night there after that. At this point, they could really care less about the contract, and so her and Sam immediately started looking for a new place to live, and they were willing to pay the least penalties if it meant getting them out of there. No matter how beautiful or historic a place might be, it's just not worth staying if you're sharing it with something that doesn't want you there. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below, mind the gap, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.